Hello, thank you for joining me today. This is Jessica from Purple Puppy Paper Crafting with a video for Brutus Monroe. I'm using some of the July subscription products today, including the Underwater Friends Stamp and Die Set and the Coral Reef Stencil. I'm starting with the stencil, and that is going to make our background. I'm using the Perfect Blend alcohol marker cardstock, as this is really smooth and I love to ink blend on this paper. I usually order the 8.5 by 11 pack, and then I cut it down into quarter sheet sizes because this is usually the size of card that I work with. To start, I used the Coral Reef stencil that I had already used before and had some pixie spray already on the back of it. Pixie spray is a temporary adhesive that helps adhere down your stencil to your paper, but doesn't leave any marks and it doesn't rip your paper when you take it off afterwards. For the background panel, I'm using some light gray ink just to ink blend over the entire stencil. This will just give a nice soft background to our card base. I'm also using the Coral Reef stencil for a focal image, and that I wanted to make a little bit more colorful. So I wiped off the gray ink, and then I'm going to put it back down on my panel and use 3 different colors of ink: pink, purple, and turquoise. And I'll blend those around through the stencil, blending in certain areas and just making sure that I get color all around. When I'm done there, I take off the stencil and then use the same color combination to ink blend over the entire background. I wanted to cover up all of the white paper and just wanted those 3 colors to show through. I think these 3 colors are really pretty together, and they all blend together well to make pretty color combinations. The next step is to put the stencil back down over where we had already stenciled so it lines up, and I'm using the purple Chroma glaze to put through the stencil to add some texture and shine onto our project. This Chroma glaze is really easy to work with, and I just use a palette knife and spread it evenly over the background. Once this is done, we need to set it aside and let it dry. I'm going to be die cutting this piece, so we want to make sure that it is really dry before doing so. I let this dry for several hours before I put it through the die cut machine. Isn't that so pretty? I love these colors together. Now I'll set that aside, and the next thing we need to do is to stamp our images. I'm using the Detail Ink Raven from Brutus Monroe to stamp all of my images today. This ink is great for Copic coloring as well as watercoloring, and I'm going to be doing some Copic coloring today. I'm stamping out the mermaid and the little image with the seaweed. I'm going to double stamp just to make sure I get a nice crisp black line on these images. Once I have those stamped, I want to use the little seashell stamp now to stamp in a light purple ink or a light pink ink and use this as part of my sentiment. I don't want the stamping to be very vibrant since I'm stamping a sentiment over it, so I'm going to stamp off on a scrap piece of paper before I put it onto my cardstock. This will give me just a really subtle shell stamp that I will ink blend over to give it some color. There is a die for this image, so we can die cut this out and put our sentiment on it in a little bit. For my Copic coloring, I picked out several different shades of pink, purple, and turquoise, and I used just 2 different shades from each color to do some shadows and shading and blending. I do some very simple blending with my Copic coloring, but I still think it looks really pretty. I used vibrant colors for this mermaid, and I think it really works for our project. Now that our coloring is done, we're coming back to the seashell and going to stamp our sentiment. I chose this Seize the Day sentiment because this fits perfectly onto the seashell and stamped it with some purple ink. I think this coordinates really well with all of our background colors and our mermaid colors. Once the background with the chroma glaze was dry, I die cut that with a heart, and I went to line it up on our card panel with the coral reef stencil that is on there in the light gray ink. I want to make sure it lines up perfectly, and I'm putting it down onto our card base with some foam tape. I wanted to have a little bit of dimension. I like to use a craft pick to help get the adhesive liners off of the foam tape when I'm using this for my card projects. I love having the dimension of foam tape, and using the craft pick to get the liner off makes things really easy. We really need to look at the patterns and make sure we are lining up the coral reef from our heart, lining up onto our background. Once I had it lined up, I pressed it down so it would adhere down onto the card base. But I noticed that it wasn't completely in the center. And that's okay because this is where I wanted the heart so all the patterns lined up. So all we need to do is cut a little bit off of the right edge to help make it a little bit more even. Once that was done, it was time to figure out where we wanted to put our images. I decided that the seaweed image didn't really fit on the front, so I'm just using the mermaid and the sentiment. I'm using some liquid glue to adhere down our sentiment shell onto the side of the heart. And then for the mermaid, I'll use a combination of foam tape and liquid glue. The part of the mermaid that is hanging off of the heart will need to have some foam tape so it can rest onto the card base. The parts of the mermaid that are going onto the heart, I used liquid glue on. Next, we just line up our mermaid onto the heart, press it down, and our card project is finished. I hope you enjoyed our mermaid card today, and leave me a comment if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you and have a great day.